Coming up on Locked On Dodgers, we're going to talk about Eddy Alvarez, David Price. We'll talk about the possibility of the Dodgers carrying 16 pitchers to start the season and what that would mean for the rest of the roster, and a lot of other stuff. So let's get Locked On Dodgers.
You are Locked On Dodgers, your daily Los Angeles Dodgers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Dodger fans. This is Locked On Dodgers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen every day. Remember, this show is free and available on all podcast platforms and on YouTube simply by searching for Locked On Dodgers. Or even better, go ahead and subscribe in all those places so you never miss a day, because you know we're not going to. If this is your first time listening or watching, my name is Jeff Snider. My co-host is Vince Samperio, although it's just me today. Vince and I are both lifelong Dodger fans, just like you, and we've also both spent time covering the Dodgers in the press box and the locker room, so we're not quite insiders, which is a good thing, but we bring you the smart fans' perspective on our boys in blue every weekday morning. So again, please subscribe wherever you're listening or watching, and please subscribe on YouTube, even if you're not watching it there, and let's talk about the Dodgers. So another good game for the Dodgers on Wednesday night. Obviously, as we've mentioned many, many times, spring training results don't matter. And so we're not that excited about the Dodgers winning. I think it was 12-1. I don't know. It was a big win. They got a grand slam for the second day in a row from a left-handed hitter who is not going to be on the major league roster for opening day. This time it was Eddy Alvarez. And I had actually been wanting to talk about Alvarez anyway. And so the grand slam gives us a good excuse to talk about him. Eddy Alvarez is a really, really interesting story. There was a good story about him on Dodgers Insider on MLB.com. If you haven't read it yet, you should check it out. It gives a lot of insight. If you've been watching the spring training games, listening to the broadcast, you know Eddy Alvarez has been a silver medalist in the Olympics twice, once in baseball and once in short track speed skating. As part of the U.S. relay team in the 2014 Sochi Olympics. He won silver with that team and then won silver with the U.S. baseball team in 2020/2021. One of very few people in history to medal in both the summer and winter games in totally different events. And this article goes into a lot of detail about kind of his life. He only played 1 year of college baseball. That was junior college at Salt Lake Community College, just up the road from where I live here in Utah. Presumably he was in Utah training for speed skating or something. Something about the Winter Olympics, I assume, is what brought him to Utah. He's from Miami originally. And he was down in Arizona and met up with a guy who had gone to high school with his older brother. This guy was named Carlos Castillo. I thought this was really cool. I have a connection to Carlos Castillo. Carlos Castillo is a great dude. He was a former pitcher for the White Sox, but before he made the major leagues, he pitched in the minor leagues, as most of them do, including for the Lake Elsinore Storm when I was in high school. And when the Storm first moved to Elsinore, it was a huge deal for me, being a huge baseball fan, my hometown getting a minor league team. They were an affiliate of the Angels at the time, and Carlos Castillo was an Angels minor leaguer pitching for the Storm, and we became, decent friends, not like great friends, but, we were friends, and he would leave me tickets. And I've told the story before that he was one of a few guys who would leave me tickets, and because they all got, 4 or 5 free tickets to each game, and most of them didn't have family around, so they weren't using them. And so he and Todd Blyleven, the son of Burt Blyleven, was another one who would leave me tickets. Jim Campanis, the grandson of former Dodgers GM Al Campanis, he and I are still in touch. But they would leave me tickets, but the only stipulation was that I had to give them the ticket stubs, because on the back of the ticket stubs was a coupon for a buy one, get one free Western Bacon Cheeseburger from Carl's Jr. And they were minor leaguers getting paid like minor leaguers. And so they needed the coupon so they could afford to eat. So that tells you all you need to know about how minor leaguers are paid. But Carlos Castillo, I met him then, and really good dude. And so anyway, back to Eddy Alvarez. Castillo went to high school with Alvarez's older brother. So Eddy was down there in Glendale at Camelback Ranch visiting the White Sox camp, and Carlos Castillo introduced him to some people, and ultimately they ended up signing him to an undrafted free agent contract, and he went to the minor leagues and toiled in the minors for a long time, and eventually made it to the big leagues in 2020 during the COVID season with the Marlins, played a little bit in 2020, a little bit in 2021, and then signed on with the Dodgers. And the way he talks about the Dodgers organization, it reinforces a lot of the things that we've heard from a lot of different people. And, we know the Dodgers have a great player development system. We know they draft well and they develop well and everything. And we focus on these guys that they draft. But this article really goes into detail about how it applies to guys like Eddy Alvarez too, and he's not young. He's, 30-ish. And he, it has had a couple cups of coffee in the big leagues. But he's a guy who, he said when he signed, the quote he says is, "It was like they knew me better than I knew myself. They identified things in his swing. Basically, they liked the athleticism, and they identified some things that they thought they could help him be a better player." And then, according to Will Rhymes, the Dodgers director of player development, he said they liked him as a player, but what they didn't know until they got to know him was he is what they call an 80 grade person. Meaning, that scout talk. Basically, he's a great person and a great student of the game. He is a learner. And so he is absorbing everything they're giving him. And it's showing in the spring training. He is hitting the ball really, really well. Even before this grand slam he hit on Wednesday night, going into that game, I think his spring OPS was pushing 1,000. I mean, he has really, really hit the ball well. He has a lot of flexibility. He can play several different positions, which obviously the Dodgers value. And after the game, reporters asked Dave Roberts about Eddy Alvarez, and Robert had nothing but good to say about him, while also saying, yeah, he's not going to make the opening day roster. But what he said was that Alvarez is going to help the Dodgers win some games this year. He's just not sure when. And that's as good as you can get, because the fact is, there's going to be injuries. And one of the things Dave Roberts said a couple weeks ago, early in spring training, about Alvarez and a couple of the guys was, he said, having major leaguers to fill those spots when injuries happen is a big deal. And so even though Alvarez has not played a lot in the major leagues, Dave Roberts is thinking of him in those terms, as this is a guy, he's a big leaguer who, when we need somebody coming up from the minors to fill a spot, he's an option. We're going to talk in a minute about a couple of those other options, guys like Jake Lamb and Kevin Pillar and stuff. But Eddy Alvarez being lumped in that group is a big deal. He hits left-handed, which maybe might work against him a little bit on this Dodgers team, just because the Dodgers are kind of lefty heavy right now on their bench. But, a lot of that depends on who it is that gets hurt. Somebody's going to get hurt at some point. And so Eddy Alvarez, I agree with Dave Roberts. I think it's almost inevitable, even though he's not on the 40-man roster, I think it's almost inevitable that he will spend some time in the big leagues this year and end up taking some key at-bats and playing some key moments for the Dodgers. And hopefully, like Dave Roberts said, hopefully he can bring that veteran leadership, even though he's not really a veteran of the big leagues that much, but he is a veteran of life and seems to have a good head on his shoulders. And so hopefully that, combined with his baseball ability and whatever the Dodgers are able to continue to unlock in that baseball ability, will help him contribute to the Dodgers this year. So Eddy Alvarez is a guy who I've been wanting to talk about for a week or two. He deserves to be talked about, and I'm excited to see what he can do. I don't expect him to be, a superstar, but I think he could be an important part of this Dodgers team in 2022. I'm going to come back in a minute. I'm going to talk about another guy who might have a possibility of being an important part of this team, and that's David Price. So thank you for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen every day, and please keep it Locked On Dodgers. So after months of playing, college basketball has determined the top teams for the Final Four and will determine this year's national champion this coming week. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all your betting needs and sports info. From all the latest odds, contests, and player props, you name it, BetOnline remains the best spot for all your latest sports developments, including podcasts and reviews for all the leagues this season. And it's not just basketball. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering information needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino games. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. All right, I am back, and as I promised, we're going to talk about another guy who has a chance to be a contributor for the Dodgers this year, and that's David Price. David Price pitched for the first time in a game on Wednesday night, looked really good. And I was actually, even before he started pitching, I had kind of an epiphany about David Price. And that was when he was throwing his warm-up pitches and they popped up his stats from last year. And I saw that his ERA last year was 4.03. And I thought it was worse. And it wasn't. And even his FIP was only 4.23. And so it's not like he was super lucky. He outperformed his FIP a little bit, but overall, I mean, he was a 4 to 4.25 ERA kind of guy. And what I realized even before he started pitching is there's a lot of value in a guy like that for a team like the Dodgers, because, if David Price could throw 190 innings with a 4 ERA for this Dodgers team, he could win 20 games. Like the Dodgers don't need him to be a superstar. And so I realized that maybe we're judging David Price against the standards of old former Cy Young Award winner David Price. David Price led the league in ERA in 2012 and 2015. He has been really, really good. He's finished second in the Cy Young voting twice and finished first once. Like, he used to be very, very good. And so I wonder if the fact that he's nothing close to what he used to be maybe makes us forget that he's actually still potentially really good. Now, the big caveat there is he only threw 73 innings last year. And some of that was usage, but some of that was also health. And that's the big thing. If he can have a 4 ERA for 73 innings, not extremely valuable. There's some value there, but not a ton. But a 4.03 ERA over a full season, that's very valuable for a team like the Dodgers. Now, David Price isn't going to be in the starting rotation to start the season, but he could be built up to that point. And depending on the health of the other starters, depending on Andrew Heaney, as of right now, he's going to be in the starting rotation. He has not been good yet in spring training. He wasn't good last year. And so we know he's a project the Dodgers are working on. At this point, it's anybody's guess whether that project will work out. And so there's a decent chance that the Dodgers will need to replace Andrew Heaney in the rotation soon. They have Tyler Anderson lined up for that too. But David Price is a guy who could fill that role as he gets built up. He talked to Kirsten Watson after his performance on Wednesday night when he pitched a shutout inning, looked really good, got 2 strikeouts and a ground out. Talked to Kirsten Watson, and he talked a little bit about why he's not built up. He said every year in spring training since 2011, he's had a couple weeks where his arm hurts, and he's already gotten through that and gotten past that this year. So he's confident that he's going to be healthy now. And then he said that they haven't really talked about his role going forward. They're just kind of getting him built up. And so, who knows what they're planning on doing. Dave Roberts said they could use him in a multi-inning role, but they're open to using him as a 1-inning reliever. They haven't really talked that much about it. But whatever it is, David Price has potential to be solid. And, he's a guy, he hit 93 apparently on the gun on Wednesday night, which is pretty good for his first start. He's not really a hard thrower anymore, and so that's pretty good. And maybe that ticks up a little bit if he is a 1-inning reliever guy, and maybe he has some value there. There's a lot of different ways David Price could be valuable to this team. The other thing that I noticed about last year, his first 2 games of the year in early April, 2 runs in an inning and 2/3, 3 runs in 2 innings, and then his last game, 2 runs in 1 inning. But in the games between those, which would be 36 games between those, he had a 3.39 ERA during that stretch. I'm as guilty as anyone of basically, I said just on a radio hit yesterday, if the Dodgers could find a taker for David Price, they would trade him in a minute, in a heartbeat. That's probably still true, but I think I have been underestimating or understating the potential of David Price actually being a contributor to this team. He's not going to be their number 1 starter. He may not even be a starter, but I feel like David Price potentially could contribute to a really good Dodgers team. And that's something that I hadn't really been allowing for very much in the last few weeks and really all off season. So just some thoughts I had on David Price even before he pitched, and then he looked really good pitching. And so it was just kind of solidified and made me think, okay, yeah, I need to talk about that tonight. I'm going to come back in just a minute, and I'm going to talk about Dave Roberts' comments about the possibility of the Dodgers starting the season with 16 pitchers on the roster and what that would look like and what that would mean for the rest of the roster. So thank you again for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen every day, and please keep it Locked On Dodgers. Hey, thanks for making Locked On Dodgers your first listen every day. Can I tell you about Locked On MLB Prospects? Host Lindsey Crosby is a prospect encyclopedia, and he's going deep on the MLB stars of tomorrow. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. All right, let's talk a little bit about some of Dave Roberts' comments before Wednesday's game. He was talking about, just giving updates on some people, and he mentioned Caleb Ferguson. And we've talked about Caleb Ferguson earlier in spring. It was said that Ferguson and Tommy Kahnle, who are both recovering from Tommy John surgery, both were unlikely to be on the opening day roster. And we've been saying the last few days that Kahnle, that's definitely still the case. But we started wondering, is that really the case for Ferguson? Because he's pitched several times. He looks pretty good. But Dave Roberts reiterated that Caleb Ferguson is unlikely to start the season on the major league roster. And the big reason for that is more of a managing workload thing than a readiness thing, because he's coming back from surgery. He's probably not going to be ready for a full workload of a season. And basically, Dave Roberts, what he said is that they would rather manage that workload early in the season so that later in the season they can just use him how he needs to be used. And then the other thing that Roberts said in that same conversation was he mentioned the possibility of starting the season with 16 pitchers on the roster. He hadn't specifically said that in the past. He did say, as I mentioned here on the podcast last week, he said that the Dodgers would, the 2 extra roster spots for those first 3.5 weeks of the season, he said the Dodgers would be using those and maybe more for extra pitching. And so that left the possibility, basically, we knew there was going to be at least 15 pitchers on the roster, and that left the possibility of even more. But for Dave Roberts to actually come out and say, we might have 16 pitchers, I thought, okay, so let's look at what that would look like. And the fact is, right now on the Dodgers roster, they have, they have 16 pitchers on the 40-man roster who have a chance at the opening day roster. If we rule out Ferguson and Kahnle and obviously Trevor Bauer, if we rule out Phil Bickford, what we're left with is Tyler Anderson. I'm just going in alphabetical order by last name. Tyler Anderson, Justin Brule, Walker Buehler, Garrett Clevenger, Tony Gonsolin, Victor Gonzalez, Brusdar Graterol, Andrew Heaney, Daniel Hudson, Clayton Kershaw, Evan Phillips, David Price, Blake Trinan, Julio Urias, Alex Vesia, and Mitch White. That's 16 pitchers. And if they decide to go with 16 pitchers, it could just be those 16 guys. Now, the only other guy who could play into the possibilities is Shane Green, as we talked about the other day. He's the only non-roster guy with a chance. He pitched an inning on Wednesday and looked good. Actually, he might have only faced one batter. I think he came in and just faced the last batter of the game and struck him out. He's looked fine. I don't know what to think of Shane Green. MLB.com doesn't even have Shane Green on the roster right now, like even in the non-roster invitees. That's how much MLB.com hasn't thought about Shane Green, and I'm kind of in the same boat. But, I guess I could see the possibility. But the issue is, the 40-man roster spot. Something would have to open up, and we don't really know if they would want to do that for a guy like Shane Green when you know that you have guys like Jake Lamb and Kevin Pillar, who I'm going to talk about in a minute, who might need those spots at some point. So, we're looking at those 17 pitchers, 16 spots. I still, having 16 pitchers would mean only 12 position players, which basically means just 2 bench spots besides Austin Barnes. And that's ultimately why I still don't think that they will do it, because if you have only 12 position players, you have those 2 bench spots. And Hanser Alberto is going to be one of those, almost for sure. I guess it's possible they could do something with Alberto, like an IL stint, do it as late arrival, say he's not quite ready for the season or whatever. But that would leave them with a mostly left-handed bench. So I think Hanser Alberto is a virtual lock for one of those 2 spots. So then you would have one spot for Edwin Rios, Gavin Lux, Jake Lamb, or Kevin Pillar. And so, like I said, that's ultimately why I don't think that they would go with 16 pitchers to start the season. Now, on the other hand, they only have 2 days off in the first 20 days of the season, and they only have 3 total days off during this expanded roster period. The new CBA has limits on how many times a player can be optioned in a season, but those limits don't start until after May 1st when the rosters go back to 26. And so you still have the mandatory or the minimum 10-day option limit for position players. It's 15 days for pitchers. But talking about these position players, still a 10-day minimum, but they could easily, split those 3 weeks between Edwin Rios and Gavin Lux, for example, have one of them spend 10 days in the minors and then swap them. The other one spends 10 days in the minors. So that's a possibility. But even that leaves both Jake Lamb and Kevin Pillar on the outside looking in. The challenge with both of those guys is they're both veterans who can't be optioned. So once they're on the 40-man roster, they're kind of stuck on the big league roster. Otherwise, you have to DFA them, put them through waivers in order to send them back to the minors. But on the flip side of that is minor league contracts have opt-outs. And both of those guys in the next few days will have the option of opting out of their contract if they haven't been assured of making the opening day roster. I'm not sure if these rules changed at all in the new CBA. So what I'm about to say is basically my understanding based on the old CBA, but I think it's still pretty accurate. So the way that works is 5 days before the start of the season, if a guy who is in camp on a minor league contract, and he's a veteran, not all minor league contracts are the same, but these guys are both veterans. So basically, if by April 3rd, I guess, they haven't been told you're going to be on the open day roster, they have the option of opting out of their contract. If they don't, they get a $100,000 retention bonus. The Dodgers have to pay them $100,000 to stay in the organization and go to the minor leagues. And then if that happens, then on June 1st, they could then opt out again if they haven't been called up yet. Kevin Pillar, I feel like just based on some of the things he said when he signed with the Dodgers, he seems committed to learning from the Dodgers organization, and he feels like that's the right place for him. So I don't expect him to opt out. Jake Lamb, I don't know. I haven't heard him say anything, but he has hit really, really well in spring training. So he's a guy who you could see the possibility of him thinking, well, I might be able to get a major league deal somewhere right now if I opt out. And so that's the kind of thing that, it's a possibility that they could lose Jake Lamb if they don't put him on the big league roster. We saw that a couple of years ago with, what's that guy's name? I can see him. He's a generic guy, bats left-handed, ended up hitting a lot of home runs not a lot, but a good number of home runs for the Phillies last year. It'll come to me in a minute. But it was kind of that same situation where he hit really well in spring training, but the Dodgers told him, you're not going to make the opening day roster. He opted out and he caught on. I think he ended up playing with Tampa Bay. No, he had come from Tampa Bay. Anyway, there's a lot of things I remember about this guy. None of those things are his name, but you know who I'm talking about. So anyway, that's a potential issue they run into with Jake Lamb. And that's kind of the only reason that I would see them putting him on the opening day roster is because of the opt-out possibility. But again, like I said before, once he's on the 40-man roster, he basically has to be in the big leagues because he can't be optioned. And so it's a delicate dance they have to do. I do expect to see Jake Lamb at some point in the big leagues this year, but I don't think it's going to be opening day. But then all of that combined goes back to what I was saying, how I just don't think it's likely that the Dodgers will actually start the season with 16 pitchers. Even though I can understand why they would be tempted to do it, I just feel like it would cause more issues for their position players than it's worth, especially because, when I was reading those names of the potential guys who would be among those 16, there's a couple guys, you don't need Shane Green on the roster. You don't need Mitch White on the roster. It's not like all these guys are just beating down the door saying I absolutely have to be in the big leagues. My performance warrants it. And so it would be one thing, like on the other hand, Edwin Rios. Yeah. Edwin Rios is saying, I am a major leaguer and I should be in the big leagues. He is making his case and he's making it very well. Gavin Lux isn't as much, but Gavin Lux has the positional flexibility that the Dodgers covet. So, but on the pitching side, none of these bottom of the list guys are making that case of I must be in the big leagues. And so it seems like it'll be easy enough to send a couple of those guys down and just start the season with 15 pitchers. So that's kind of what I'm expecting at this point. A little bit disappointed that Caleb Ferguson won't be starting the season on the roster, but the fact that the Dodgers have this many pitchers who are potential, and then knowing that they get Phil Bickford and Caleb Ferguson and Tommy Kahnle within the first month or so of the season, and then potentially Trevor Bauer back, depending on what happens with his case, and then obviously Dustin May later in the season. A lot of potential for a lot of good from the Dodgers, and combine that with this offense, and it could be a really fun season for the Dodgers. So that's going to do it for me today. I really appreciate you guys listening every day, watching every day, whatever you're doing. We appreciate it. It's very gratifying for us we look at the numbers, not because the numbers matter, but because they they represent actual people who are watching and listening. And so I hope you guys know we don't take that for granted. I want to give a shout out to the one person from South Dakota who listened to our show last month. Whoever you are, we see you. I was looking at the most listeners by state, and I thought, I wonder what the least is. And South Dakota had exactly one listener. So whoever you are, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear from all of you. So you can reach out to us anytime you want. We're on Instagram and Twitter at Locked On Dodgers. Vince is on Twitter at Vince Samperio. I'm on Twitter at Snydog. I forgot to tell you, after making Locked On Dodgers your first listen, go ahead and for your second listen, check out Locked On MLB, where Paul Francis Sullivan, please call him Sully, brings you his unique perspective on the major leagues past and present. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. You can email us at lockedondodgers@gmail.com, or you can reach out to us via voicemail or text message at 323-863-LOCK 5625. We are here every weekday morning, and we hope you'll be here with us. When you get in the car or sit on your couch, tell your smart device to play podcast Locked On Dodgers. And remember, you don't have to agree, you just have to listen. We'll talk to you tomorrow.